and professor at the University of East London. His research examines how infants' attentional systems develop, how stress and the home environment shape early cognitive abilities, and how caregivers and children become physiologically and neurally in sync. Dr. Wass uses cutting-edge methods using dual EEG, wearable sensors, and naturalistic home-based recordings to study interpersonal neural entrainment, co-regulation, and how mature brains support the developing attentional and language systems in early childhood. Before we get started, just a couple of items to mention. Many of these podcasts, including today's, will include an accompanying course on speech therapy PD that is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. And we each receive some compensation from Speech Therapy PD, but there are no relevant non-financial disclosures to report. And so without further ado, Dr. Wass, welcome to Beyond Words. How are you doing?
Hi, Garrett. Thanks for having me. Yeah, good. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, so excited to have you. I usually just ask the guests a bit about their origin story. I love hearing how people got into the fields that they're in, and especially interested in development and language. So I was wondering, what got you into this field?
Yeah, I've had a funny route into kind of developmental neuroscience. So I started work in theatre, and one of the things we're probably going to be talking about today is I do a lot of work in the UK for kind of training kind of early years practitioners and kind of looking at kind of language development in schools. And I do love to come back to this point that neuroscience often has taken us to the same conclusion that acting has. So a lot of the solutions for how actors talk to a theatre full of 1,000 people are quite similar to how one practitioner talks to one 3-year-old for reasons that we can talk about. So yeah, my route in was that, and I was always very interested in children's theatre and children's opera, and then so I was travelling around in Europe. There's a lot of money for opera and theatre in kind of the German speaking world. It's a really big cultural thing there. So I was living out there and working there, and after about 10 years I fancied having kids and stuff, so I came back and did a stable job where I can stay in one place. But yeah, as I say, there's a lot of overlaps between the two that we can be talking about.
Amazing. And you've just had a child recently, right?
I've got a 3-month-old, yeah, so I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a
Amazing.
3-month-old. So yeah.
Congratulations. Yeah, and we have one on the way too. So this is perfect timing. I get
Okay.
to ask about more
Okay.
tips. Go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so cool. I love that. It's amazing to me how many people I talk to that have come in through the arts into this field. And I do feel like they come to similar conclusions. So yeah, I'm coming from a music background, and
Mhm.
all of the things that I, have kind of learned through jazz, like skill learning and improvisation. I feel like somehow they just overlap,
Mhm.
and they're so deeply tied to this
Yeah.
field.
So one of the things that I'm really keen to be talking about today, Garrett, is this idea of, why there are so many kind of overlaps between kind of music and language. And a lot of them come down to the fact that they're both modes of communication that we've developed to tune into the ways that our brains naturally work. So, our brains are naturally rhythmic. So, if I were to ask you to shut your eyes in a closed room and measure, we use a technique called EEG, which is the kind of the surface kind of electrical activity of the brain, then you'll find this, incredibly complex kind of patterns of rhythms. Strongest at about 7 cycles per second in a kind of eyes closed kind of resting state. And with children, we can talk in a bit about how their rhythms are different, but they're there, but they're different in some important ways that have got important implications for communication. But basically, when we're paying attention to, speech and to music, our brain rhythms, we call it entrain. So our brain rhythms start to match the rhythms of the speech that we're tuning into. And it's exactly the same with music. And what's really interesting about that is that the reason that we naturally speak at the speed that we speak, and we don't speak like this, and we don't speak like this, and we do fast like that, is because, and it's the same kind of with all languages around the world, we speak at roughly the same kind of frequency. And it's because the speech, the speed that I'm naturally speaking at, so as I'm speaking, I'm opening and closing my mouths, and that's generating periodic fluctuations in the volume coming out of my mouth. And those periodic fluctuations are strongest round about this 7 cycles per second speed. And it's because I'm generating a rhythm, yeah, which is close to your naturally occurring brain rhythms. And as part of paying attention to your speech, your brain rhythms are tuning in. So they're starting to track my speech rhythms. But it's easier for them to do that if the speech rhythms that I'm naturally giving you are close to the rhythms that your brain are naturally happening at to start with. So that is why we speak the speed that we speak, because we've evolved that as a mode of communication to be as easy for our brains to pay attention to as possible. And there are lots of other kind of research looking at kind of music that we adapt how we play music. The reason that we make music and the way that we make music is because it's easy for our brains to kind of tune into that type of thing. So I think there's a lot of reasons why there's this kind of crossover between speech and music, and so many similarities between the two, and really, really interesting to think about, I think.
That's incredible. I can't wait to get into it. That's so interesting that we have evolved to speak at this rate to match brain rhythm fluctuations. Is there so a lot of the things that in your work kind of point to how caregivers can help to sort of help with child's attention through different means. Is speech rhythm, the way that you speak to your child, is that influencing their ability to pick up language and to learn how to speak as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's loads and loads of different answers I could give to that question, Garrett, and we can start to unpack some of them as we go. But one of the things to start with, I think, is directly following on from what I was just saying. So I was saying, in an adult brain, you get the strongest rhythms at about 7 cycles per second. And they're a very strong pattern of rhythm. So you can look at the raw brain signal and you can see these fluctuations very strongly to the naked eye. In a child's brain, you get two big differences. One, the predominant rhythms are slightly slower. So their strongest rhythms tend to be around 4 cycles per second. And also they're messier, so they're more irregular. Yeah. And naturally, when we speak to children, we speak slightly slower. Yeah. So there's lots of research into kind of child-directed speech, and the strongest kind of rhythm is a slightly slower pace than in adult-to-adult speech. And that's for the similar reason to what I just gave you. We've worked out that children's brains, who's naturally are oscillating at a slightly slower speed, they find it easier to tune into rhythms that are slightly slower. But there's another thing that I want to talk about as well, which is, particularly in the context of kind of book reading. So we've been doing a lot of research looking at kind of shared parent-child book reading. It's also present in all child-directed speech, but I'll say about that in a second. But particularly with books, and I got interested in this when I was looking for books for my own kids to read. I guess it was when Freddie, my son, who's 6 now, was probably about 2 years. And I don't know if you have Julia Donaldson in the US. So like the Gruffalo. So a mouse took a stroll through the deep, dark wood. A fox saw the mouse and the mouse looked good. And I remember looking through the books on a bookshelf that we had for my 2-year-old son and thinking, I feel physically nauseous at having to read another book with this dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-da rhyming couplets, or with these, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum meter, or these very, very strong rhyming couplets. So, there's another one by her called The Snail and the Whale. And it's about a snail that takes a journey on the tail of a whale. And then, oh, look, the snail is leaving a trail. The teacher turned pale. And it's just these endless, like really, really heavy ale kind of rhymes. And I just, I'm going to be sick if I have to read that again. And the other thing was these, another popular book in the UK. I don't know if you have it. It's a book called Dear Zoo, which is kind of, it's got these rhythms in it, but in a slightly different way. So it's all about kind of repetition. So I wrote to the zoo to send me a pet. They sent me a giraffe. He was too tall, so I sent him back. So they sent me a lion. He was too fierce, so I sent him back. So they sent me a camel. He was too grumpy, so I sent him back. And basically, the whole book is on every page, apart from the first page and the last page, 8 out of 10 words are the same, and then 2 words are different. Yeah. So those are kind of 3 different ways in which book content for children tends to have these kind of exaggerated kind of rhythmicities, yeah, either meter, da-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-da, or kind of strong rhyming couplets, or these kind of repetitions. So exactly the same sequence of words occurs on pages. And I got interested in why this was, purely from the point of view of just, trying to find something that was different, some type of content. And then I was like, well, why are they all doing this? Why are they all the same? And we think probably now, having done some research on it, it comes back to this idea of children's rhythms. So children's brain rhythms are naturally messier. They're naturally more, if you do it, you can, there's lots of technical stuff that we probably don't need to go into, but you can calculate the ratio of periodic to what we call aperiodic activity. So some of the brain activity is this oscillatory, regular four, looks like a sine wave, 4 cycles a second. And then some of it is irregular. And in children, there's more of irregular. But if you give them this very strong, exaggerated rhythmic content, a mouse took a stroll through the deep, dark wood, then their brain rhythms will start to track the rhythms in the speech. That's fundamental to speech perception. And we think that giving them a very strong, exaggerated rhythm to start with just helps their naturally messier brains to tune in and to keep to that kind of more stable, more adult-like pattern of firing, which is in speech perception. So that's an idea that we're thinking a lot about. That's, this idea that, back to this idea of attention. So if I have an environment where there are lots of kind of different types of rhythms happening, it's easier for my brain to tune into periodic features, so regular features of my environment. So that is why we structure language content for children. And as I said, you see this particularly strongly in the context of books, but you also see it in natural child-directed communication. So other studies, my colleague Vicky Leong at Cambridge has done some research showing that naturally when we speak to children, we exaggerate the rhythms in our speech slightly, not as much as you do with children's books. So that's how to link kind of that type of rhythm to attention. There's lots of other kind of ways to answer that too, but we can get to those in a second.
Cool, that's amazing. So we had Jenny Safran on not too long ago, and it reminds me of like kind of her idea of statistical learning in the environment. And one thing I also have been thinking about is how this kind of relates to the idea of chunking, which is something in jazz and as well, where you have to learn certain little patterns, and then you learn these chunks to then put them together. And so like when you have a world that's so chaotic and we don't have any like chunks built up yet in our brain, like we don't have those statistical regularities set in, we like infants would naturally, crave these like statistically regular rhythms to pick up on those things.
I was actually talking with one of my postdocs today about exactly this. So this is another area that we're really interested in. So we're just setting up to do some analyses looking at children's books. And he's done some previous work. This is someone called Pierre. He's done some previous work looking at a kind of a slightly different type of rhythm in children's books, which I'll get to in a second. But what we were talking about today was very closely related to this idea of chunking, which is that we're interested in this idea of hierarchical structures. So basically, the way that kind of our experience of reality is structured is that we have kind of these hierarchical goals. So if my higher order goal is to cook supper, then that has within it a series of nested sub-events. So, now I'm cooking the pasta and now I'm cooking the pasta sauce. And then each of those then has another series of nested sub-events within it. So when I'm cooking the pasta, now I'm boiling the water, now I'm getting the pasta out of the packet, now I'm putting it in the pan. So you have these hierarchies. I have a high goal, which is cook supper, and then that has a series of nested sub-goals, and that within it has a series of nested sub-goals. So you get the same kind of hierarchical structures in story. So one thing to say before that. So this idea of, I have my overarching goal and then I have a series of nested sub goals, and the way to that goal is we think it's kind of subserved by the frontal cortex, so the part of the brain just right under the forehead. And if you get, damage to your frontal cortex, then, you have problems holding a goal in mind. So you're more likely to walk into a room and say, why did I just walk into this room? And we also know that children's frontal cortex tends to kind of develop. It's the slowest part of the brain to develop, the frontal cortex. So, children's experience of the world, children find it harder to maintain goals. They tend to be much more free flowing. They don't have a higher order. I'm trying to achieve this, and to do that, I need to get that. They tend to kind of flow from one experience to the other. And that's linked to this idea of frontal cortex. And one of the other reasons I'm really interested in, stories as a tool for cognitive development in children, quite different to this idea of rhythms, is the idea that stories by definition have a structure. You have a kind of hero goes on a journey, and then a series of events happen on the way to the journey, and then it's got this kind of big structure. so for example, the Gruffalo, which presumably, you must know the Gruffalo. It's a mega famous story in the
Yeah.
UK. It must be the same
It's
for you guys,
it's not in the US, I don't think, but when I was living in Malaysia with my wife, a lot of the Malaysians like their kids loved the Gruffalo. I heard about it
It's
so
not
much.
in the US.
Or I don't know, it might be, but maybe
God,
someone
that's
else could chime
insane.
in.
It's like the
It seems
most
like some
every.
people know it, but
Okay,
I
fine.
don't hear
Okay.
about it a lot.
Well, I'll explain it. Then you'll probably be able to think of a thing. So the Gruffalo's got this kind of hierarchical structure. The mouse, yes, we have it. Good, Rosie's
Oh
saying
yes,
yes.
we have it.
Yeah,
Okay,
okay.
cool.
So like a lot of stories,
Amazing.
the Gruffalo has this kind of hierarchical structure. The mouse goes on a story, yeah, and then has a series of things, and then meets the Gruffalo, and then kind of escapes, and then kind of it ends up with the mouse kind of achieving. So it's like a hero's journey, like classic things. And then on the way, they have this series of events, yeah. So this kind of simple, experiencing this structure again and again and again, we're really interested in this idea of how does this help with children's, own ability to see their own structures and their own everyday experience. But what I was talking about with my postdoc today was a part of this, which is you get these. So for those of you who know the Gruffalo well, it starts off with, the mouse taking a stroll, and then he sees the fox, and then the fox says, would you like to come and have tea in my house? And then the mouse says, no, I can't. I'm going to have tea I'm going to meet the Gruffalo. And then the fox says, who's the Gruffalo? The mouse says, who's this big scary person? Do you want to come? And then the fox says, no, I'm running away. Yeah. And then you meet the owl, and exactly the same conversation, series of events happens. Yeah. He says, do you want to have tea? The mouse says, meeting the Gruffalo, etc., etc. And then he meets the snake. Yeah. So if you think about this in the overarching structure, the mouse is on a journey. He meets that one person, has a series of things that happen, then he meets someone else and has exactly the same series of things that happen, and then he meets someone else and have exactly the same series of things that happen. Yeah. And this actually happens twice in Gruffalo. It also happens at the end after he's met the Gruffalo, he's walking back seeing the same things, and you get the same kind of series of events. And this is a feature of children's books, yeah, that you have like a series of things, chunks that happen in the same order repeated times. Yeah. And what I was talking about with my postdoc today is I think this might be really interesting in terms of helping children. You get these, mega exaggerated, clear, hierarchical kind of goal structures. And this idea, you get these kind of repeated goal structures might be a way to help children to perceive this idea that, the world has a goal with these series of nested structures. That you get these really strong exaggerated rhythms. Because if you think about it, that never ever happens in an adult book that you do that. So yeah, that's another way that links in really closely to your idea of jazz and how you learn. What was the word you used for it, Garrett? You learn these kind of chunks, and then you kind of assemble these chunks into meaning.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually like these little riffs that there's a lot of these repeated harmonic gestures in jazz, like like a 2-5-1 is a very common one, where you have the 2 chord, a 5 chord, and then a 1 chord, and you have this like library of licks that you learn over these these little harmonic progressions. And over time, you can, instead of just hearing individual notes, you start to hear patterns, and then those patterns like get larger and larger, and like you can hear the whole structure. It's there's a lot of repetition and theme and variation, and all of this nested in jazz.
Yeah, and I bet the pattern that you go through as you're learning it is very similar to how you assemble these chunks of meaning in books, that you probably start off with this very simple, more exaggerated chunk structure where you get exactly the same thing happening again and again and again. Yeah, like as I was describing for Gruffalo. And then over time, as you progress, you go to more kind of free flowing, where those chunks are still there, but they're kind of more smudged over and harder to perceive, as they are in adult literature.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot, because there's one thing that I've seen in my clients over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, is like their narratives are becoming harder to understand and less organized. It seems like that narrative, the higher order nesting of structure within a story is sort of breaking down in some ways. And I'm wondering what you think about the sort of the landscape of digital media and stories these days, which seem to be they seem to have less structure, at least in terms of, if you think of something like scrolling through little tiny TikTok shorts or something, you have less statistical regularity. There's nothing that's like nested in a higher order story. And even the stories or the cartoons that you watch, like kid shows these days, are becoming less coherent to me. Like when I watch them, it's hard for me to perceive, what structure there is. There's a lot of like unresolved, plot points and, even things that don't seem to be a story. And the stories that I hear my kids tell often sound like that to me, like
Yeah.
almost like I can't get it without very idiosyncratic context.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, we've just got a consultation underway in the UK. We're just issuing some screen time guidance for 0 to 5s. I've been talking a lot with some colleagues, your colleagues in the States, Heather Kokorian and Jenny Wadetsky, who kind of were contributed to the American Academy of Pediatrics guidance for screen time, and I've been doing some analyses looking at exactly that. So another thing that you might know in the Night Garden. And Teletubbies in the Night Garden was a kind of very popular earlier show in the UK about 25 years ago. And I was actually doing an analysis looking at the story structure of that. And it's very, very similar to the story structure of Gruffalo, that it just has the one episode that we were looking at in detail. It just had Macapaca, who's the main character, going up to Upsy Daisy and washing her face, and then went on a walk, and then went to Iggle Piggle and washed his face, and went to the Tomneyboos and washed their face, and went to the Pontypine. So it was the same thing, the same kind of unit. So there was kind of an overarching kind of episode structure, which was Macapaca's day, but it had this same extremely modular, extremely kind of clear kind of chunking to help them to kind of see these patterns that were there, kind of contributing to this higher order goal, exactly like I was just saying for Gruffalo. And then we were comparing that with 25 minutes of viewing study from actually American data and 4-year-olds viewing YouTube Kids. And it was, in the same time that, a kid 25 years ago had watched this one episode with one story arc that took 25 minutes to unfold, that was just these 5 separate kind of chunks. In the same time, they'd watched like 12 YouTube videos with an average time of 2 minutes per clip, completely different, unrelated narrative stories. So it's really kind of a big kind of difference. Just one thing while we're on screens, I want to get back to rhythms because there's a lot more I want to say about rhythms.
Of course.
But just quickly while we're on screens, the other point that we've been thinking about is, why do they do that? So why is content changing in this way? And basically, from a neuroscience, so why is it becoming shorter, more fragmented, and that type of thing, and less, hierarchical, less structured. And basically, in brain terms, we think there are kind of 2 routes to paying attention to something. So one is what we call comprehension-driven attention. So I understand something, and as a result, I'm paying attention to it. And this is very much happens with the frontal cortex, so the bit under the forehead here. So if you measure people in the brain when they're doing that type of attention, then it's kind of predominantly kind of frontal cortex. But then there's another route to paying attention, which in brain terms is very different, which is when there's movement in our visual field, it's very hard not to pay attention to it. Yeah, we call it kind of an automatic, kind of involuntary kind of attention capture mechanism, and that happens in a very different part of the brain. It's right at the bottom where the brainstem comes into the bottom of the brain, part of the brain called the superior colliculus, and we've evolved like that originally probably as a threat detection system. So back 10,000 years ago, our environments were pretty dangerous. So it was, if there was movement in our visual field, it was an advantage to us to have our attention kind of automatically drawn to it, even if I'm trying to think about something else at a time. Nowadays, of course, it's very rarely, actually useful for us to pay attention to movement. And if anything, but it's still hardwired into our brain, to pay attention if there's movement anywhere in our visual field. And it's kind of exploited by kind of technology makers to kind of attract children's attention to the screen. So we've got these 2 very, very different routes to getting children to pay attention to screens. One is it's paced at a level which is developmentally appropriate for a young child. Yeah. So something like that Night Garden episode I watched, where I just described, which was a 25-minute episode where basically 5 different things happened in that 25-minute episode. And they're all basically identical. Macapaca went round to 5 different ones of his friends and washed their face. Yeah. That's at a level which is developmentally appropriate for a 2-year-old in terms of the complexity, also the pacing of the plot that they can follow. Yeah. With this very, very clear, exaggerated structure that I was describing to help them to, segment it and to chunk it. Yeah. So that's one way to get them to pay attention. The other way is just have constant movement and constant change and what we call flicker, kind of constantly attractive. And they're both ways to get kids to look at screens. Yeah, they're both successful for getting kids to look at screens. But as I say, they target very, very different brain mechanisms. And the reason that we think that the makers of content are increasingly using the latter, so there's really good evidence that screen content is getting more fast-paced and more unpredictable, is simply because it works immediately, and it's kind of automatic. Yeah. So even if I don't understand the content, if it's moving, it's very, very hard not to look at it. Yeah. Whereas comprehension-driven attention takes time to build up. Yeah. So the first time you watch a very, very slow-paced TV show like The Night Garden, a child won't be particularly engaged with it because they won't know any of the characters. They won't know what's happening. There's no movement. There's very, very little movement to actually draw their attention to the screen. But then if you watch it with them a few times, and they start to understand and they start to recognize the characters and they start to learn the story arc, the repeated story arc, then they really, really pay attention to it and they really, really love it and will watch it for a long period of time. But it's just that initial bump. Yeah. So this fast-paced kind of, we call it salience driven. So movement driven attention just works immediately. It's involuntary, it's automatic, and it works for everybody all the time. Yeah. Whereas this comprehension driven attention only works for some people and it builds up over time. You have to understand what you're watching for it to work. So that is the reason we think why the makers of screen content are increasingly shifting towards this, fast-paced attention, capture-driven attention. But of course, from brain terms, from brain development terms, there's no doubt I don't want my kids doing that. I want my kids doing the slow-paced, comprehension-driven attention. That all of the positive benefits for, benefits from screen time come from these kind of very, very slow-paced, repetitious things like Night Garden. So I just wanted to get that in because I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And I see that in myself. Like, I was at a museum the other day and it's like, I could easily just kind of scream by everything and be like, oh yeah, I saw it all. I'm seeing this next thing. But like the attention that you pay, if you sit down with one thing, you start to get more out of it. You see like some higher order meaning or something like that.
Yeah. There's just actually one more thing before we get back to rhythms, which I do want to get back to. There's one more thing on that. So there's another bit of research I've been thinking about a lot, again, for this evidence that I've just been submitting to our Department of Education for this review that we're doing at the moment, is about this idea of kind of being kind of how relaxing we find kind of screens versus reading. Yeah. So basically, screens, there's good evidence that screens, short-term and long-term increase kind of physiological stress, because there's a lot of information coming at us when we're viewing screens. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of sound coming at our brains when we're viewing a screen. And our brains are prediction machines. So the way they work is constantly trying to guess what's going to happen next, what we're going to see next, what we're going to hear next. And when we're in a situation where there's too much coming at our brains, we go into, again, it's probably an evolutionary mechanism. We go into this mode of, I'm in an unpredictable situation. I don't know what's going to happen next. So I ready my body to go into this high kind of stress state. So my heart starts to beat faster. It's a sympathetic nervous system. So fight or flight. My heart starts to beat faster. I get a lot of energy to my muscles. And again, we've evolved like this over, a long period of time, because when I'm in an unpredictable situation, I might have to be ready to kind of break at a moment's notice. So that's how screens affect us. How books affect us is very different, because screens, we have a lot of quite unpredictable, very intense, high bandwidth information coming, so a lot of sounds, a lot of sights. Whereas when we're reading a book, if it's a print book, we just have a very low bandwidth of information coming at us. It's just black shapes on a white page. And then our brains are kind of building out. So they're using their imagination to build sights and sounds and smells onto these words that we hear. But because so much of this activity is self-generated, it doesn't take our brains by surprise. We're not, trying to keep up with this information that's coming to us, because we can tell what's happening because everything's self-generated. So that is why there's really good evidence that screens immediately increase physiological stress. So screens immediately put us into sympathetic. Whereas books, even short bursts of reading, if we're engaged with it, it kind of it reduces stress. So there's good evidence for that too. But the tricky thing is making that transition. And there's a really interesting kind of point to be made here. I just was doing a TV thing about kids, doing detox or coming off screens. So this was ADHD kids doing detox. And they were saying straight off coming off screens, it's really hard to get into that, reading a book. And we understand quite well why that is too. And it's basically when I'm in a high stress state, yeah. So when my sympathetic nervous system is high, I'm in a high kind of arousal state. Again, probably for evolutionary reasons, we don't know, but probably we change how we pay attention. So my attention becomes much more, we're much more likely to pay attention to movement anywhere in our visual field. We much find it much harder to focus on one thing, yeah, when we're in a temporarily high stress state. Yeah. And again, that's probably because if I'm in a dangerous situation, it's more important that I pay attention to movement anywhere in my visual field because it might be a threat. Yeah. Whereas when we're calm, we find it easier to focus. Yeah. So straight after I've come off screens, yeah, the reason it's very hard to get into paying attention to a book is because books don't, have movement to capture our attention in the same way. Yeah. So when I'm in a temporarily high stress state, I find it hard to get into a book. Yeah. But if I can get calm enough to get into a book, then because it's this kind of low bandwidth, easy for my brain to manage information, then my brain finds it relaxing and I get there. Yeah. But it's just making that transition from a screen, which puts me into a high stress state, which changes how I pay attention, makes me more driven by movement. Yeah. And how do I make that transition from a screen, which puts me into that state, into a book? And if I can make that transition, then I can keep on relaxing and keep on getting calmer.
I see. Yeah, it reminds me of the idea that you talk about arousal matching, where like parents can match the arousal states of an infant to help them regulate, which is also, I don't know if you know this principle in music therapy called the ISO principle.
No, I don't know.
It's basically, so music therapists have this, and there's some people that are using this in music medicine, where instead of, like if you're feeling sad, just playing happy music, that often just kind of can be annoying for people because it's like so apart from the state that they're in that you can actually help people move out of certain states by starting at where they are. So if they're feeling quite sad, you can start with kind of sad music and then slowly change the music such that you kind of lift them out of that state a little bit more easily. Yeah, so that's called the ISO principle.
Oh, interesting. So that relates actually to that idea that what I was saying at the beginning, that the speed at which we naturally communicate is quite similar to we naturally communicate at the speed we naturally communicate at because it's quite similar to our brain activity. There's something, I think it's called Arno's tongue, which is it's easier to tune into something when it's close to the rhythm that I'm going at already. So that's exactly that same idea for music therapy. Yeah. So can we just now we've kind of got back to rhythms through music. Can we just talk a little bit? And you mentioned it a little bit, Garrett, this idea of these other types of rhythms and these kind of body rhythms. Yeah. So so we do lots of research on kind of co-regulation. So kind of parents and child's body rhythms influencing one another. And particularly we've done a lot of work in the context of shared book reading. Yeah. And a lot of the kind of principles of what I've been talking about in brain terms, yeah. So I've been talking about how children's brains are more messily rhythmic, yeah, and how if we set a really clear external structure through our rhythmic language, it's easier for a children's brain to tune into it, yeah. And a lot of the same ideas apply at a larger timescale to body rhythms, yeah, to kind of stress rhythms, yeah. So in exactly the same way, yeah, our bodies are rhythmic, yeah. So you have kind of, or in my body, I have a symphony of rhythms going inside me, yeah. I have my breathing and my heart rate, periodic fluctuations in your blood pressure every 10 seconds called the Maya wave, through to, appetite, through to sleep-wake transitions, through to yearly rhythms, yeah. So we have lots and lots of different kind of neural and endocrine rhythms going inside us. And similarly for children, they have these rhythms, but they're slightly messier. Yeah. And one of the things, so there's a couple of ways in which shared book reading, which, as I say, is very well evidenced to be help to induce relaxation. Yeah. A couple of different ways in which that we think that this idea ties into this idea of rhythm. So Firstly, when I'm doing shared book reading, so I'm sat with my kid on my lap, yeah, I'm naturally breathing in a different way to how I breathe, yeah. I'm naturally taking slow, deep breaths in and letting them out slowly, yeah. When we're speaking, we breathe differently to how we're not. And that is also happens to be the way that we breathe when we're calm. Yeah. So I'm breathing as if I'm calm. Yeah. So getting someone to read out loud, even if they're not feeling calm, it forces them to breathe as if they're calm. Yeah.
Mm.
And children pick up on these rhythms. So children, particularly if it's a child sat on your lap and there's physical contact, we're very, very sensitive to picking up on each other's rhythms. So just by setting that kind of breath rhythm through a child, that's one of the ways in which we call it kind of affect contagion. So helping mood to change from one person to another. So that's one way. And then, so that's kind of at the kind of second scale. Yeah, you force these kind of slow, regular, periodic body rhythms into your own body through the act of reading aloud, and then the child picks them up through the contact with you. And then the other way in which you can think about that is an even bigger time scale. So one of the things I talk about a lot when I'm talking about with early years teachers is the importance of daily routines. Yeah, doing the same thing at the same time each day.
Mm.
And we think that one of the reasons why this is really important for young children is exactly the same idea as with the brain stuff. So if you set a strong, stable, consistent rhythm, yeah, it's easy for a child's body rhythms, yeah, which remember are naturally messier, to tune in to this rhythm that you're setting them, yeah.
Mm.
So, in the context of a kindergarten day, yeah, if I'm always, doing my physically active kind of outdoor time at the same time each day, then, I can tune that. So that's going to be one of my high points of my physical arousal during the day. And then if I'm always doing book reading at the same time, then, just setting that external structure helps a child's naturally irregular body to tune in to these rhythms that I'm creating. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly
amazing.
like
Yeah.
regular speech helps brains to tune in. So that's why, a book at bedtime, for example, is proven to help manage that big transition into sleep. Yeah, and also kind of regular kind of book reading at different types of day. So we're quite interested in, when children often arrive at kindergarten, that's often, they've often been wired and had unpredictable home situations, and it's hard to make that transition. Yeah. And for older children, for us, it's reception when they start school at age 4 or 5. They often struggle with the transition back from lunchtime, because lunchtime is a playground and it's chaotic, and
Yeah, sure.
struggle to make that transition. So we're doing some kind of hoping to do some research, looking at how we can use books and this regularity to help them manage that transition. So it's all about setting these stable rhythms to help
That's
their
so
body
cool.
tune in.
Yeah, it totally made me think of just like music, how it has so many nested rhythms in it. And the pulse that you set is like, your daily routine. And within that pulse, like that pulse actually helps you to feel the internal rhythms of the melody and the chord changes and everything like that. It just like lets you anticipate. And one thing I've heard you talk about too is like this, your brain as a prediction engine. Like when you are a child who is going from lunch to back to the playground, it's your lunch back to the classroom, it's your first time doing that, and you don't predict what that you have to go from this really high stress, high arousal state to sitting in a desk. That's going to cause some issues with that stark transition that that you can't predict it. But over time, if you're able to have that steady rhythm, just like in music, when you have the pulse, you can
Yeah.
fall into those rhythms more naturally. That's so
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same idea. So I love this idea of kind of these nested rhythms, as you say. It's interesting that they're also discussed in the context of music, particularly with mood regulation. We place there's this great, where did I get it from? I can't remember where I got it from, but there's this idea that we place a big emphasis on the idea of being still, yeah. But in fact, the idea of stillness is an illusion. We're biological organisms. All biological organisms, they can't. The only time we're still is when we're dead. Yeah. The times when we achieve stability through this constant even movement. Yeah. And this idea of telling a child to be still, it's not. It's about kind of setting kind of these rhythms for their brains always to be going. But exactly, we've been talking about this in the context of physiology on rhythms on the hour to minute scale, but it's exactly the same idea, I think, in the context of these faster rhythms. Yeah. So we've been talking in speech about these sub-second rhythms, but we've also done some research. Actually, my postdoc Pierre, who I was mentioning earlier, talked about how you get these kind of periodic rhythms in a lot of content in language content. So chorus and verse, for example. Back to another famous British one. Do you have bear hunt? We're going on a bear hunt.
Oh yeah,
We're
that's
going
one of
to
my
catch a big
favorites.
one. Okay, fine. That
Yeah.
like we're going on a bear hunt. We're going to catch a big one. What's a beautiful day? We're not scared. Oh, grass. Big wavy grass. We can't go under it. We can't go over it. Oh no, we've got to go through it. And then the same, but it's a very, very repetitious at this kind of at the chorus verse scale. Yeah. And that is also, we think, related. So another example, sorry to plant the earworm, is Baby Shark. So if you look at Baby Shark, do, 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 Baby Shark, do, 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 it has exactly the same thing, that there's new information, yeah, Baby Shark, and then there's what we call redundancy. So just repetition of that information, yeah. And then Mummy Shark, do, 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 and then redundancy, yeah. So you get these rhythmic, if you look at, if you look at the rate at which new information is being introduced, you get a spike, you get some new information, then you get repetition and redundancy, then you get new information, then repetition and redundancy. And Baby Shark's a particularly stark example that it's very, very periodic when this new information is coming in, just like Bear Hunt, just like lots and lots of different, children's books that work in this chorus and verse. And we think it's probably the same thing, that the brain, if this new information is presented periodically, yeah, the brain starts to kind of ready itself, so starts to prepare itself for new information to come in, if it's in this kind of predictable structure. Exactly as you say, Garrett, at the larger scale, when there's regular activity or something like that, at an hour scale, my body starts to prepare itself in advance. So there's all sorts of rhythms, and there's all sorts of ways in which predictability and kind of routine and kind of repetition and this this structure, this periodic structure, is really, really important for helping children to achieve this kind of stability and kind of attention and focus.
Yeah, amazing. I was wondering, what do you think the the parent role is in this, or in the therapist role, I suppose, like whoever is working with the child, how does their feedback, or their contingent behaviors, how does that affect the child's development of those rhythms, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So we'll get on to contingency in a second, because there's also loads of stuff I want to say about contingency. But just while we're on this, setting a structure. So I guess there's lots of different. So we're doing it not in kind of the context of speech therapy, but we're looking at this in the context of kind of phonics, so language and literacy learning, and also maths learning, actually, in what's it called in the States between like 4 and 5? We call it reception. It's still kindergarten for you, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Between 4 and 5. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So we're doing it, between kind of 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And we're thinking about, trying to think about different ways in which we can introduce this idea, basically, make the way that we teach more like Bear Hunt, which you talk to any teacher who does Bear Hunt regularly with their class. A lot of classes in the UK, they do it regularly, and they all say they've got no problems paying attention to that, but they have problems paying attention to other content. And there's lots of different ways. So firstly, it's worth thinking about these sub-second rhythms that we started off, yeah? These just loud, soft fluctuations, yeah? Ways in which you can kind of make your speech more rhythmic. But then there's also kind of this idea of what I was talking about the verse and chorus structure, yeah? So some of the time in phonics, so this is teaching kind of written speech sounds, when you have a sound like ooh, if you're teaching it to a class of 4-year-olds in the UK, we'd have first of all, you look at it and then you sound it out, and then you embed it in a word, and then you segment it, and then you fuse it with another word, and then you write it. Yeah. So you have a series of different things that you do with that phoneme ooh, and you always do them in exactly the same order. Yeah. Another way of thinking about it in the context of teaching is, I do, we do, you do. So every time you introduce a new concept, you always do it in exactly that same order. Yeah. So that's another way of building these kind of rhythms and predictability. Every time I've got something new, I'm going to do exactly the same 5 operations with it. Yeah. And then another way of thinking about this idea of kind of rhythms and having a structure is if there's a very strict kind of call and response. So now we used to have 4 and then we had 1. So that means we've got and then you leave it. So if you say exactly the same sequence, but then always leave a hole in exactly the same place for them to fill in the key word. And it's another way to create these ideas of rhythms. But so those are some of the, more subtle ways to do it. Obviously, there's no more obvious ways to bring in rhythms and predictability, which is chants and actually kind of introducing rhythms while you're doing it, which kind of there's also worth trying too. So there's lots and lots of different ways of kind of using call and response, using kind of repetition and that type of thing to build these kind of structures and predictability. Yeah. And again, it's basically this idea that these kind of structures and predictability, we think, because our brains are fundamentally rhythmic, it's easier for a brain to tune into something that is kind of structured and predictable. And then if I've got these, we call it kind of synchronized patterns. This is directly what we measure when we're measuring children's brains listening to language. We have these kind of synchronized patterns of firing between, the structure of the content that is coming at me and, my own natural brain activity. And once we're in sync, once we're firing in sync, then it's easier for me to tune into new information. So you use the repetition and the redundancy to get this kind of synchronized pattern of firing, which means that the new thing that you present, they're tuned into it. When it comes. So that would be the idea in principle, at least.
That's really cool.
I mean, that's said from a neuroscientist, not from a speech therapist. So you guys have to think how to actually implement this. But that's the principle.
Well, it's making me think too of like how I just love all these like. It just, you see it as a therapist, like how much, how well kids attend to these regular structures. Another thing that seems to be, maybe this is rhythmic, maybe not, is the semantic content, or maybe it's not semantic content, but like there's something about the goal or the higher order structure of like, so a narrative, like when you have these lines or phrases in a narrative, I see kids say them so perfectly, and then outside of that, maybe they can't use those same words in a meaningful way, and so there's something about the goal, or it seems like the whole context of that narrative is being encoded in what they're learning in speech and language, and it's a really, really helpful structure.
That's really interesting. And do you out of interest, do you use that deliberately then? I can use this word in context, but I can't use this word out of context. Do you use that to, introduce them to a new thing? So you set the same repetitious kind of phrases going, and then you get kind of familiarize them to that, and then you try and get them out of context. Do you use that?
I'm a huge proponent of doing that.
Okay.
Using that, because I realize that, a lot of times you can build more and more structure in, and you could strip it away. And sometimes we don't think about that. Like a decontextualized flashcard with a single letter on it is like very, like there's not a lot of structure in that. Like they're just saying this one sound. And it's the hardest thing to get kids to pay attention to and care about. So, I just think part of it is this, like, it lacks this interesting structure that kids are sort of drawn to trying to figure out these regular patterns, and it doesn't have any patterns that are meaningful. Even just putting that same sound in a carrier phrase where the kid is asking for something, that's a better structure to learn in than just that decontextualized flashcard. So if you're learning the G sound, or like the G sound, it's better to have them say go outside or go to the park, and then you go, like at least that tiny little micro narrative is better than having no structure.
That is really interesting. There's something I want to talk a bit more about predictive coding as well, but because that would be another let's just talk about that quickly, and then I want to talk about you talked about this idea of contingency and being child-led, which I also want to talk about before we finish. But just quickly, another reason from neuroscience that this idea of kind of carrier phrases is useful is this idea that, as you were saying earlier, I was saying, and you mentioned it too, that our brains are prediction machines. So we're constantly generating predictions for what we say, what you hear. Sorry. as I'm talking, your brain is constantly trying to guess which word is going to come out of my mouth. So if I then cabbage and say a word that's unexpected in the context, then if I was measuring your brain activity, I'd have got this kind of error signal or a surprise signal that I wouldn't have got if I'd said a phrase like, yesterday I went down to the shops and I bought a cabbage. Yeah. We can tell from that type of thing that we're this way of generating predictions for what I'm going to hear next is partly just off the kind of word regularity. So it's partly, our knowledge of how words fit together, but it's also from these higher order ideas of context and meaning. And there's some really lovely research from someone you should get on if you can is Yuri Hasson, who's at Princeton. He's done some beautiful research looking at these hierarchies in the brain. So low down in the, for audition, it's A1, so kind of quite close to the ear. We kind of make these kind of very simple predictions, but then higher up, as we get higher up the processing stream, we increasingly use kind of context to try and guess what words we're going to hear next. And that would be another reason why putting the carrier phrase in kind of helps with the thing, which is quite slightly different to that idea. But yeah. But anyway, can we get on to talking about contingency? Because you also talked about that. Okay.
Let's do it.
I wanted to talk about this at the same time as talking about the idea of rhythms, because kind of in some ways they're opposite. So we're just doing, as I mentioned, this intervention with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. I've got one PhD who's looking for specifically at this idea of teaching rhythms in the context of maths teaching, where it's really hardly heard of at all, this idea of teaching in rhythms. And one of the comments that she's getting as pushback is, isn't this very robotic? Yeah. And this is something I want to talk about, because we're doing this paper. I've just been doing a paper on kind of co-regulation, so shared kind of mood states and shared attention states, and applying kind of this theory called dynamic systems theory, which is about how dynamical systems interact, through to this idea of how do we share attention and how do we share mood states, and we title the paper after this poem by T.S. Eliot, "The Dance at the Still Point of the Turning World." It's a beautiful kind of section from the Four Quartets about how we're dancing around this still point. Yeah, so we're continually both partners in a dance, so adapting to one another, and we achieve stability through movement. Yeah, so we keep in one place through constantly dancing and adapting. And this idea of a dance has got these two elements. Yeah, one is this idea of rhythmicity that we've been talking about. Yeah, so if there isn't a rhythmic structure to it, it's not a dance. But that on its own isn't enough to make a dance a dance. It's this idea of kind of adaptation, and that you're continually micro adapting what you say depending on the partner, that is also integral to this idea of a dance. And there's loads and loads of evidence that we do that. So we've done a lot of research looking at shared book reading, for example. Yeah, and when you're reading a book to a child, you're setting all these rhythms, as I've been saying, but you're also at the same time continually adapting, not just what you say, but how you say it, dependent on lots and lots of very subtle kind of millisecond level cues that you're getting from the child. So we've done some research that, things like how up and down in your voice you go. Yeah. So times when, a child's neural engagement starts to wane, then you naturally start talking more like this, because up and down kind of captures attention. And then when the child's more engaged, then you change how you say your voice, and you're more likely to introduce new kind of semantic information. Yeah. So it's both of these things that kind of are opposite, yeah, but are kind of integral, yeah. One is how you set the structure, yeah. So the structure is necessarily comes from you. It's this regularity, it's this predictability, yeah. But at the same time as setting this regular and predictable structure, you're also constantly dynamically micro adapting your state, missing a step here or there, or skipping, or going ahead, or speeding up or slowing down. It dependent on cues from the child. Yeah. So they're kind of opposite, but they're kind of integral, both to this idea of dancing, and to this idea of, how we establish and maintain shared mood states and shared attention states when we're interacting one-on-one with a child. So I just wanted to kind of throw that idea out there as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea. And, and there is research on, some of yours as well, on how contingency can increase a child's attention. And so in this dance, like you're you actually have a pretty strong ability as a partner to help a child, kind of build up these attentional structures.
Yeah.
And one thing that, that I want to make a plug for is, like in-person book reading, shared book reading, like in person versus just having your kid watch a YouTube video, because that happens a lot. And, if you watch these videos of the story, it's like, it's great. It has the rhythm, but there are all these like non-contingent parts of the story. Like you don't know when the child is saying something. Oftentimes a YouTube video will ask a question like, what do you think about it? Or like, or they ask a question like, what did he just say? And then they're like, good job. But you don't know if that was like actually when the child said something or
Yeah. That's a really, really important point, actually, Garrett. So in the context of, adult reading, so if you look at all, older child reading on their own, yeah. If you think about, so there's nothing when you're making these eye movements, that, in exactly the same way with TV, that with screens, that your eye is getting captured by the movement. Yeah, there's nothing that all of the control of your individual eye movements is from yourself and under control. And if you think about it and if you measure it, so we've done it's really irregular. So you don't read at a regular pace. Yeah. You're kind of reading a few words, then you'll pause, look away, and then you'll read a few more. And you're basically controlling the rate of information uptake. Yeah. And it's determined by when your brain is ready to receive information and when it's not. And similarly, when you're sharing books with children, it's a really irregular. So sometimes you press forward and then sometimes you pause, often, I've read, there's another lovely series of books, Jez Albright. I don't know if you have them. They're mainly picture books. So there's just one or two words on each page. And there's a lovely bit where the monkey is, I'm blanking on the name, Push, something like that. But there's a scene where the monkey is reunited with the mum, and the mum is the big kind of smiles. And when I read that with my kids, they'll stay on that page for about 2 minutes, just tracing kind of the outline of the mum's smile with their face. And it's because so much of the world just happens too fast for a young child. Their brains are really, really slow. And books just have this amazing ability to show a moment frozen in time. So much emotional communication is just too fast for children, but books kind of freeze time like that. So they'll sit and they'll look at it for 2 minutes, tracing the smile. And then we'll go on to the next page and then they'll want to go back. Yeah, and they want to revisit it. And exactly as you say, this idea that there's a lovely Miyazaki who did lots of Japanese kids films, Spirited Away and Ponyo and My Neighbor Totoro and things like that. I read an interview with him where he said exactly this point, which is he wishes that he could make films that sped up and slowed down dependent on the speed that the child needs at that moment. We know that their brains are messy. They're very stochastic. Sometimes they're ready to receive information. Sometimes they're not. Our adult brains are like that too, but children's brains even more so. And that's what's crucial about language through face-to-face interactions, that we can adjust, like micro adapt what we're giving and when, dependent on these cues that we get very good at reading from children. So you're absolutely right. That's the crucial point of difference between, face-to-face reading and getting stuff off screens.
Oh, man, amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. I know we're kind of running short on time. If people, so I haven't been looking too much at the comments, but
no, I haven't been looking
has any
too much.
couple questions, feel free to ask as we have a few more minutes left. But yeah, while we're waiting, thank you so much. You're an inspiration, and just thank you for the work in this area. It's super important, and really
good. No, I agree. I think it's really important, and it is, particularly if anyone's got any thoughts on this idea that these kind of roots between this move, because it's such a stark move towards I mean, there's one thing which is the move away from face-to-face communication. The one other thing I was going to say, actually, I forgot. Let me just put it in if waiting for the if there's any questions. But one of the other things that I wanted to say earlier, which is really important about this idea of predictability, is one of the things that we've got really good evidence is happening now. Is one of the crucial elements for predictability is when I'm this idea that I'm giving cues as a child to an adult, and it's essential to this idea of early communication, that the adult is reading these cues and responding to them, exactly what we've been talking about, this idea of contingency. And one of the things that sadly we know is true is technoference. So so firstly, as adults, we've been so sped up by the modern world. We get used to consuming this fast-paced information that, children are naturally, their brains are naturally slow, and they haven't had so much modern world, so they're not as sped up. So the kind of gap between the speed at which an adult's brain goes and the speed at which a child's brain goes is much bigger now than it was, 200 years ago. So like Maria Montessori, who was writing about 100 years ago, she doesn't really speak about this idea of, getting down to the speed of a child. And it's much, much harder now. But also just, our consciousness is getting pulled in lots of different directions. So 100 years ago, I was in a room with a child, and I could internally, my mind would start to wander, but there's nothing to suck my attention away from the child like there is now when everyone's got a constant screen that's going light up and their things. So from a child's point of view, adults are much less predictable, but some much more than others, and that really it gets in the way of this contingent learning, which is really, really crucial. And I remember we had a meeting a while ago, Garrett, and you were saying some of the children that you kind of look after, you think they have especially unpredictable kind of caregiving environments and caregiving kind of settings, so which makes it really, really tough. So it's getting in the way. So the work that you guys are doing, compensating for this through giving these kind of super reliable, super contingent, super child-led is absolutely crucial.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for saying that. And yeah, thank you everyone in the chat. Getting some nice comments coming in. Appreciate you all coming in. And yeah, is there anything, I guess I was, wanted to know really quickly what you're most excited about and like what you think most needs to be studied now. What are the areas of unknown that you'd like to explore?
Yeah, I mean, the bit, I don't know. At the moment, I've kind of got a policy head on because I've been doing a lot of this policy work. And the bit that I would love to figure out is this, how do we encourage the makers of content to get back to this idea of comprehension-driven attention? Yeah. Given that, we know, that what children need is very, very different. Yeah. So the neuroscience is very clear, definitely really strong evidence that, we need exactly what we were talking about earlier. We need these kind of low density things where not very much happens kind of per second of the viewing content. Yeah. So in 25 minutes, only, 5 different things might happen. Yeah. And we also need these kind of super exaggerated structures so that each of these 5 different things that happen in this 25 minutes is very clearly differentiated and delineated, and each follows the same pattern. So you get these, exaggeratedly clear narrative structures. But we also know that this is the type of thing that, as I was saying, builds up over time. Yeah. And it doesn't have this immediate, like, look at this crash bang work, kind of capture your attention. But how do we encourage people to make that kind of content for young children, given that, it's going out so fast? I mean, it's still there in books, but screen content is going out, and it used to be there in screens too. There are some, one of the things is in the Night Guard, and certainly in the UK, you sold loads of merchandising because when you get into it, you really love the characters and young children really engage. Whereas Coco Melon famously can't sell merchandising yet because kids will watch it for hours and then, but if they're just, it's this attention capture, it's a very different relationship. So I don't know if there's a way in through there, or any time. It's really hard to regulate for. How do you force people to target these comprehension-driven networks rather than this kind of attention capture? So I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that. Then it's a really, really big challenge to think how we've got a well-identified problem that we know is making a really big difference to a lot of children, but it's really challenging to think what can we do about it? How do we encourage the makers of content to target these kind of good attention networks as opposed to these bad attention networks?
Yeah. Well, I think it seems like we have a responsibility as therapists too to talk about this to the parents we work with and the teachers that we work with. And there can be a pressure. I want to encourage therapists too, because there can be a big pressure when you see a kid for 30 minutes. You have the parent watching in. There's a pressure to do a lot, to show them a lot of material, almost in the same way that, like, hey, look, I'm doing this thing. I'm using this strategy. I'm playing Cocomelon. This kid is like really, really interested and engaged. And I think a lot of the strategies that are going to really work are going to take, are going to be slower and take a lot of time and attention and care. And the kid is not going to, if they're coming from an environment that is really, really chaotic and their arousal is quite high, I think it's going to take some, care and conversations, like difficult conversations with parents. And but yeah, thank you for sharing with this with us, because at least we do have not sway over everybody, but at least with some of the kids that we work with and some of the parents that we coach, we can make a small difference. So yeah, thank you for coming to share. And it was great talking to you. Thank you for everyone for coming. And contact you. Is there a place that they can reach you or find your work?
Yeah, sure. So my lab's website's easiest to say online. So it's isey.org. So isey.org. And that's my kind of lab group. And there's lots of kind of links there to kind of shared reading and lots of other stuff on screen. So lots of resources there. But it's been really fun having me. Thanks so much, Garrett.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam. All right, everyone. Take care. Stay curious and hope to see you in the next episode.